Sorry, we're good to start. I think we're having a little bit of trouble hearing.
Yeah, you're good to start.
Okay. Starting my speech now. Religion is an incredibly coercive force when institutions have an unlimited amount of power in order to shape the way you think and shape the way you act. In this speech, I'm going to do a few things. Firstly, talk about what this world is going to look like, giving some framing. Secondly, talk about why people are more likely to have better spiritual experiences on our side of the house. And finally, talking about why religion is going to be more inclusive for marginalized communities, allowing more people to benefit from spirituality and the mental support that it is able to provide. Firstly, then on framing and what this is actually going to look like. We think on our side of the house, religion is going to be more of an individualistic experience. People practice prayer, meditation, etc. on their own rather than at institutions. And the way this world is going to form is that individuals don't talk about religion as much as a community. Rather, you think of it more as something like journaling, where you conceive of it as more of a private action. You're less likely to think of it as something that you have to share with others and spread with others. It's thought of something that you can keep to yourself. I think what this looks like is you're going to do things like reading scriptures, meditating, etc. on your own, versus on the opposition side of the world. And in that world, people are more likely to have systematic experiences like going to church, Sunday school, where priests lead religious discussions, etc. So there's a hierarchical sort of community. We think that the incentives of religious institutions are that they want money to continue running and to attract more followers, so they continue to have a presence throughout generations and throughout time. So the authority figures at the top are likely to be able to continue their positions. More on this later. Firstly, then, on why we think we get a better spiritual experience for individuals on our side of the house. We think, firstly, individuals are more likely to experience a greater amount of optionality in the method of practice that they choose. That is to say, people can perform meditation if that seems like something that resonates with them. They can decide their own frequency of prayer, type of connection, etc., because others are not imposing on them what is right or what is wrong. You don't have an entire community judging you for what sorts of things you're doing, because people see in this world as religion as being something more private. They think that they're sort of crossing your boundaries by telling you what to do or asking you what your method of practice is. But secondly, we think that people are going to interact with scriptures and texts better. Why is this the case? I think people are able to form freer interpretations that resonate better with their life experiences, because instead of thinking through the interpretation that most resonates with your life and lived experiences, in the status quo, you are told by religious authorities in Sunday school and prayers what to think about it from a young age, because you were indoctrinated into these institutions and included in them by your parents and your family from a young age. And so it's difficult for you to form your own interpretations even at a later age. We think this changes on our side of the house. But thirdly, we think more people are able to think through spirituality on their own on our side of the house. Why is this the case? I think that spirituality doesn't automatically manifest on our side of the house just because you call yourself Christian or Hindu, but rather your religious methods and thoughts need to resonate with you. So you have greater freedom, and individualistic experimentation is good because there's no one size fits all solution, and spirituality is going to be more subjective. I think this is a unique benefit on our side of the house, insofar as mental and spiritual support is unique to religions versus something like monetary support that Op is likely to talk about can come from governments, charities, rehab centers, etc. But the sort of spiritual support you get from religion only comes from religion, and the existence of institutions really affects the way you're able to experience this and whether you're able to have a personal relationship with religion. We think we should prioritize serving this unique function, given that individuals cannot get this anywhere else, and having a personal relationship is key to them being able to think through this on their own and have optionality in the way that they conceive of religion. Secondly, then, on why we think this our world is going to be more inclusive of marginalized communities. We think that authority figures in religious communities have perverse incentives for a few reasons. Firstly, they have a material incentive to attract followers so that they have a salary and so that the institution they work at continues to run. And in order for this to happen, they do several different things in the status quo. Firstly, they often indoctrinate people from a young age when they don't have a capacity to understand, making the exit cost of religion higher. But secondly, they create social pressure against leaving by bringing the entire community together, by telling the community that those that leave the religion are immoral and are going to hell. But thirdly, they also use the concept of afterlife, heaven, and hell to coerce you into doing actions such as donations or using your time and resources to support the religious institutions, because they're able to tell you that you're not moral enough, so that you give them more money and help them to sustain their own lives and give them more power. But fourthly, we think they're likely to play into the fear that you have that you might be wrong about the existence of God. And so they're able to fearmonger you into participating more in their institutions and giving them more authority. We think these individuals also have limited oversight and accountability insofar as people think that they could lose their standing in their important religious communities if they criticize these authority figures. And also, secondly, because they think they're going against God, because they think that the individuals at the top of the community, the hierarchical authority figures, are going to be saying the word of God, and criticizing them is really bad. Why then, on our side of the house, are these individuals going to have less power? Well, without institutions, no one is legitimized by position title to claim that they have unique access to the word of God. And secondly, religious populations don't congregate regularly, and they don't form an echo chamber that confirms someone or that makes it so that there's communal social pressure in favor of doing a particular action. Why then do we think this is a good thing on our side of the house? Firstly, in the status quo, these individuals are overwhelmingly likely to adhere to majority groups, that is to say, often older men in most religious institutions. But secondly, they're likely to shield abuse because the community is likely to shield abuse because people don't see authority figures as morally fallible, and they see them as divine messengers. So they're not likely to call them out. But on our side of the house, this is not likely to happen, given that these institutions and authority figures are not inherent to the religion. Rather, people realize that the religion exists within themselves. But thirdly, there are no singular political beliefs that can be perpetuated by religious communities on our side of the house, insofar as there is the absence of an institutional statement that can be put out. So politicians cannot use this to prompt bad actions. Before I move on, I'll take closing. Opening. Okay, amazing. Even if they are benevolent, we think that this is going to be the existence of the structure itself of religious institutions is harmful insofar as the power dynamic is too stark, since the religion is coercive and it's unique to religion, unlike government. I think it's past time already for POIs. But furthermore, I think they also cannot use their authority to criticize LGBTQ people, given that often anti-LGBTQ advocacy is inherent to a lot of religions, insofar as they want people to have children in order to increase their number of followers. They can use this moralistic rhetoric in order to promote people to donate and spend their time and resources towards the institution. For these reasons, we think that it is less likely that we get religions that are going to be oppressing children and women through the protection of people who are engaging in immoral actions and who are engaging in abuse. But secondly, we also get less anti-LGBTQ rhetoric coming out of religions, insofar as people can form personal relationships with religion that are more responsive to their own understanding. But finally, I think individualized religion allows a majority of people to enjoy a sense of comfort, insofar as institutions are coercive in a way that people cannot opt out, but people are able to continually adapt their understanding of religion over time on our side of the house. For these reasons, very proud to propose.
Great. And just a quick reminder to please offer POIs during the time period in which they're allowed. Hello.
Hi, I'm just grabbing a timer. Just bear with me 2 seconds.
No worries.
Also just POIs in the chat, please. And I consent to recording, so we should be all good from that front. I'm going to start this LO speech just by responding to that point on minorities that we get in the kind of dying minute of that opening gov case. Opening government tells you that, well, people are coerced into these religions incredibly young, and they're forced to stay because priests have profit-seeking incentives. And this is very harmful to minorities and outliers who are perhaps aggressed against by those people who are coerced to stay. And you say that they uniquely fix this because now people don't question their own religious belief. They're less likely to believe in bad, hateful things. 2 quick responses, I think, knock this contribution out. And I would note that this is probably the most salient impact the opening government attempts to claim for you. The first thing to say is that that the spiritual questioning that they talk about ameliorating is likely worse, because notably this doesn't come from the presence of institutions. This was deeper existential questioning, and for religious people, it was literally the most deep and existential question you could ever ask, was whether your relationship with God was true, was correct, was something that God would accept when you eventually died. In government's incorrect conception, where these institutions do not exist on any level, I think that people are likely to lose even a barometric reading of the correctness of their relationship with God. And I think that that means that you uniquely incentivize coercive actors who are not mediated by the better mediating forces that religions are exposed to tell people that the best way to have a relationship with God is to do X, Y, Z. And notably, coercive actors who are not mediated are much more likely to have extreme and hateful opinions. We'll talk about that more in a second. The second thing that I would say, though, is that obviously people have to be exposed to religion in some way on God's world in order for them to access any of these kind of spiritual benefits, but also this idea of a spiritual relationship with God. And I think that the likely counterfactual in their best world is that people are exposed to and socialized towards religion through their families. I think that the increased salience of familial power relationships is likely significantly worse. Why was that? Firstly, because you are literally dependent on your family and on your parents as a child. They fed you, housed you, and clothed you. I think that it's significantly harder to leave that dynamic. It's significantly harder to question those people than it is a priest that you maybe only interact with once a week. The second thing is that you love those people in a way that you do not love the people who are the heads of your religious institution, and that means that you are also significantly less likely to aggress against them. But the third and most important thing to say here is that obviously there are just significantly fewer exit pathways. It is much harder to cut off your mother than it is to cut off your priest. I don't think that we ever get a structural reason from this opening gov bench about why these families are less likely to engage in hateful behavior, why they are less likely to be, for example, homophobic or misogynistic. Also POIs in chat, please. I don't think that there's any actual reason that's ever given. I think all that they say is they assert that institutions are bad and never tell us why the alternatives are likely to be better. So with that out of the way, a couple of points in setup. The first thing to say is that obviously, I think that religious institutions still exist to some extent. I just think that they are significantly less powerful in opening government's world. And I think the reason for this is, firstly, the motion never specifies that institutions don't exist. They just say that they aren't the mechanism through which people seek a relationship with God. The second thing to say, though, is that obviously religions require the creation of some institutions, particularly through things like charitable mandates. You see that through the mandate, for example, of things like zakat or things like tithing. I think that that means that these institutions probably still exist. They are just significantly smaller and less powerful in opening government's world. The second thing to say here is that probably religion is now practiced on a significantly more atomized level. And I would note that institutions facilitate the personal relationship that opening government talks about in the status quo. I just think that it's much more likely to happen at home or via significantly smaller communities now, because obviously there is still some incentive to socialize people into religion in the first place. The third, and I think important thing to point out, though, is that obviously there is just an incredible plurality of choice for a lot of people in the status quo. There are different types of churches, there are different types of religious practice, there are different types of sort of politically polarized, for example, mosques and religious communities. I think that significantly more work needs to be done to prove why all churches or all mosques or all religious practice is inherently coercive and conservative. What then is the actual change in this debate? The first is about the size and relative power of institutions. The second is the set of mediating influences on personal practice. With that in mind, let's talk about why religious practice is likely to get significantly better. And all we're going to prove in this point is that practices are significantly better when they're given the benefits of standardization. Why was that better in religious institutions? The first reason is simply that religious institutions in the status quo have significantly more academic capacity and epistemic access to that religion. That is to say, there are traditions of things like criticism and education and apology. And I think that that is incredibly important, particularly to religious people, because as I point out to you in my introduction, the truth and relative kind of correctness of your relationship with God is of extreme existential importance to religious people. That is why people seek these institutionalized relationships with God through which they can then facilitate their personal one. The second thing to say is that obviously these religious institutions can do things like aggregate the largest communities, which are also likely to be incredibly beneficial. This was things like the fact that they could provide you with like childcare groups, mothers groups, but also with the fact that they could provide you with spiritual communities, for example, to do things like group worship and group prayer, which were obviously likely to be incredibly important to a lot of religious people, particularly those who were alienated from other communities. The third is that they give you purpose and context. For example, being involved in a philanthropic drive in a church is likely to be an incredibly affirming experience for many people. The last thing to say is that their capacity to give you spiritual guidance is directly tied to the numbers of people that they have within that institution. That was to say that that is the mandate and attraction kind of point that they have in the status quo, but also is directly tied to their funding. Why then was it likely that these things got significantly worse when they were personalized? Before I get into that, I'll take a point from closing.
Yeah, so your point about apology makes no sense when religions have an incentive to bound the scope of criticism. People who criticize the faith too much are excluded from the faith, and that criticism is disregarded.
This is over 10 seconds. Okay. I think that the standard of apology is one example of a form of incredibly rich and deep religious criticism that can occur. Because I also think that obviously a whole institution, even if we argue that apology is a bad thing, is just significantly easier to critique than one single person's religious practice. I think that if your argument is in fact that all religions are uniquely bad, then I think it's probably easier to critique the Catholic Church than it is to critique Joe down the street. I think he's probably less likely to listen to you, but I also think that the actual mechanism by which you ever get the information through which you can critique that is significantly worse. If that's your argument, much more mechanistic work needs to be done. Why were these alternatives likely to be bad? The first thing was to say that you were likely to just lack interpretive tools. I think that meant people were much more likely to do things like engage in asceticism and incredibly extreme religious practice. I already tell you why alternatives are likely to be incredibly coerced, because they're likely to map onto existing and much more salient power structures. And uniquely, as a family member, for example, you now have an incentive to be particularly coercive, for example, to your children, because you cared about them going to heaven much more than a priest cared about a certain member of his congregation going to heaven. I think institutions mediate this because they can threaten to censure you, they have informational and doctrinal communication, they absorb external pressure. Note these were exclusive benefits from opening government, because obviously you could still meditate and read and leave in our world. You had a plurality of options, with the only side that proves why things get worse on God's side, vote Bob.
Great. DPM.
Great. Can you see and hear me like this?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, amazing. Parents who try to force their kids to be in the same religion exist on either side of the house. They're going to be even more pushy on their side. Why? Because if their kid doesn't go to church with them, the kid drops out of church, they'll be criticized by priests who they respect, and they'll be judged by the community that assembles every Sunday during Sunday prayer. If anything, these social pressures that an organized religion structure provides makes parents way more coercive towards their children, because it's not just an individual choice. It comes down to all their social relationships and their social standing, which forces them to use these extreme measures that they talk about themselves. There are 3 reasons why OG takes this round. First, we proved to you that this structure is unethical regardless of the outcome of what churches do. Second of all, we explained to you why multiple marginalized communities are harmed by church. And lastly, why the religious experience is going to be inherently negative on their side of the house. Firstly then, on why this structure is unethical, I'm going to first address everything to talk about like people who are questioning their religion by telling you why it's easier to change your religion or quit religion on our side of the house. They said that parents are going to talk. Again, that's symmetrical. The exit cost for the child is actually lower, like because of the fact that one, you're not realizing that you're also losing a community on our side of the house, because religion is individualistic. Like you lose this scripture, but you're not reaffirmed every Sunday like on their side of the house, and you realize if I quit church, I don't see any of these people. They might hate me, etc., etc. Second of all, at least there's not someone else with ethos, like in addition to your parents, like the priest who has taught you every Sunday since you were a child, who's also going to hate you if you quit religion on our side of the house. So if anything, the comparative is the exit cost is way lower on our side of the house. But I also want to address the stakeholder of parents. Parents exist on both sides, but parents are worse on their side, not only because of everything we talked about social pressure, but also because these are 2 worlds. This house prefers motion, not this house would do something right now. The world that forms in which religion is inherently seen as more individualistic is one in which parents won't feel free to be as coercive or as talking about this with you, because it's seen as more of a personal thing on our side. Like the norm right now is it's a communal thing. So of course I can talk about it at a dinner table. But for example, journaling and diaries is seen as more of an individualistic thing. So most parents, like extreme parents, will always exist, but most parents will try to hide they looked at your diary or looked at your journal. They won't be as explicitly coercive on our side house because of how the world's formed. And this house prefers motion as well. So that clears the way about it's easier to quit even if parents are coercive. That is way worse on their side. And there are also other exit costs on their side of house. The second thing under this clash is just regardless of outcomes. Let's say churches only do good uniformly. This is still an unethical structure because no human being should have this much power over someone else. It is a complete erasure of identity and agency to do so. The thought experiment and analogy here is blackmail. No one should be able to hold so much money or your own personal safety against you, because even if they're trying to get you to do something good, like donations or like eat your veggies, like it's just like a complete erasure of your agency for someone to fearmonger you to that extent, for you to fight for your life and then get you to do something. So what's worse here is that it's a larger coercive force when it's literally about eternal damnation that one other human being could hold against you. They could use their own personal interest freely because there's no accountability mechanism when it comes to like what is God's word. They just have the ethos of the church, which means this structure in and of itself is unethical because we don't allow anyone to enslave other people's thoughts. We also can't allow this structure to exist where there could be this possible abuse of power that someone could levy over someone else. This is isolated from outcome and goes to OG. The second argument we want to forward is about marginalized communities. Let's first zoom into the LGBTQ community. Like Uma's analysis here wasn't about spiritual questioning at all. It is just based on the fact that they will be criticized and alienated by organized religion because it conforms to these religious leaders' incentives. The Bible actually doesn't say anything explicit about LGBTQ. Like priests are using things that are somewhat related, like margin related, like sodomy or something, and they're absolutely blanket statements saying like LGBTQ people are going to burn in hell and using these extreme rhetoric. The reason is just because it is in their interest for you to form man-woman relationships, for you to procreate, like have this structure where they can increase the population of churches. Like what proves this is just small religions have even more of an extreme take. They're saying like the polygamy even is okay under the Mormon church because they want you to have as many children as possible. So what we're saying here is that the interpretation they have is uniquely going to favor heterosexuality when there's an organized structure because they want to perpetuate the population of this structure. Versus if it's your individualistic experience and you are LGBTQ, you can just interpret the scripture in your own way, in a more accepting way, instead of being told that you're always not going to be good enough. There's this anti-LGBTQ inherent incentive for human leaders that we think is just bad. The second thing for marginalized communities is just the potential of abuse of power. Like the issue is these religious leaders feel infallible when they can tell their people this is the word of God and there's no way to verify. It takes one bad priest for many young girls to be traumatized and scarred for life, because whatever they do to these girls when they are coercive, like we've seen a lot of news about the Catholic Church and like child molesting or even like sexual abuse, these children will have a lifelong impact even if it's just one or two bad apples in the basket. And because church is a child-facing organization, this is more common than you think and will harm the most vulnerable actor. Like they say churches will apologize for doing something bad. Who's going to speak up? Like the little girl who was grown up in this church and been told forever that this priest is a good person and a respectable man in her community. That's just not going to happen because only followers know what happens inside a church, and they're the ones who believe in these individuals. So there's no accountability mechanism. This abuse of power's impact itself, the chance of it happening is massive. I'll take closing.
Why will the gay kid's parents agree with the priest that their kid is a demon and is a bad person? Why are they willing to believe this when there's lots of other priests who might disagree with them?
It's so ingrained because, like, first of all, we've told you the incentive for all priests to say you should be straight because they want populations for their own church. Parents do believe this because they maybe grew up with this. They fear eternal damnation for themselves and their children out of love. So they will try to correct for kids. Like there's a reason why there's massive demand for corrective therapy that is so heinous and abusive. The last thing is poor individuals will always feel lesser than when there's organized religion because churches want money, as Uma said. They'll try to encourage donations through like comparisons, through praising people who donate, etc. So when you're poor and you don't have those resources, you will always feel less worthy because that's the inherent communal aspect of church, versus if it's an individualistic experience, you don't need to feel so. So this is all the marginalized communities that they hurt, and any of these directly take the round because of how vulnerable they are. Lastly, in terms of the religious experience being bad, like they say standardized practice is good because epistemic access, like I just don't think truth is what people are seeking when they go for religion. Otherwise they just like, do experiments and believe in science. If their express preference is for evidence, they're not going to go to church. They go to church for spiritual comforting, for applications, like ideas that are applicable to their own lives. And this is better get when you have individualistic experiences, because then you'll try out different methods of religious practice. Whatever makes you the happiest, you'll stick with instead of being told there's a good answer. And this is something that will be the most applicable to you because you'll resonate to whatever subjectively brings you the most joy. There's no one size fits all solution. So I'm not sure what this epistemic access is. Like meditating might work for me, journaling about spirituality works for Uma. This is better than any analysis you're going to get about welfare and charities, because donations still exist. Like the scripture like still tells you like helping your neighbor is good. You might still donate, and donations can come from governments or just secular organizations. But what's unique about the spiritual comfort of religion can only work when you find the solution that fits yourself, not a one size fit all solution for the prevention of abuse we're so proud to propose.
Great, DLO.
When government gets up here and tells you that they're going to preclude instances of abuse, they ignore the empirical reality that those things actually happen in homes. They ignore the reality that, independent of whether or not there exist, standardizing religious institutions that are able to set the barometers and standards that are likely to be held accountable by the incentives of wanting to remain palatable, of wanting to retain their legitimacy. That was the comparative that they had to contend with. It was people still practicing these religions. It was people still having that same degree of religious coercion, because note the fact you didn't want your kid to go to hell. The difference was that you lost the attenuating mechanisms. That was what we told you at Rose, and that was what we're going to win this debate on. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, on coercion. Secondly, on the quality of spiritual experience. And lastly, on what happens to these institutions and marginalized individuals. On the first point about them being coercive, they told you that religious institutions have an incentive to be predatory and get your money and get you to tithe. A couple of responses here. The first of which is noting the fact that there exists a plurality of religious institutions. That was to say that you had choice. Note the incentive of those individual institutions to proselytize and grow their numbers meant that they probably wanted to attract you comparative to like the other churches. That created a form of informal competition, meaning that I don't think the realistic conception is that family churches are causing you to become economically imperiled because you're giving that much of your income to them. But the second thing to say there is that oftentimes it was these religious institutions that censured smaller churches for doing things that were problematic. That was the fact that they did not want that to reflect on their own legitimacy. That was the fact that they wanted to be able to do things like charity and to have those type of like connections to be able to facilitate those things. All of that was contingent on their perception as good moral actors. We think that that trajectory exists in the status quo towards the liberalization of religions. You know, the fact you see things like progressive churches, you see the way in which the Pope has kind of retrenched on more parochial sentiments within the church. We told you that those are the things that we get under our side of the house. But I think that the third thing to say, and this is really important in understanding the comparative and how we went up over government, is the degree of uncertainty that you now engender within these individuals. Because oftentimes these texts were incredibly cryptic. They used visceral, extreme languages about hellfire. We think that at the point at which you are directly accessing them, and note the fact that people, like now it's the case that you probably seek a religion comparative to a religion like a family church after your kid's football game saying, come to our religion with your family. Now you opt into that religion. We think that creates a certain degree of adverse selection to which you're likely to do that at the most vulnerable points in your life. I think that means then that they don't actually prove that people don't ever get bad or problematic religiosity. They don't prove that people don't go too far with being ascetic or too far with taking in those principles and think that everything that they do that is bad is a sin. We don't think that they actually prove that people interpret those things in a way that is good. They prove that it is variable. They don't prove that it is necessarily good. We told you the incentives of the church to retain that legitimacy, to compete against other churches, probably meant that on the way up there, people were likely to do that better under our side of the house. But I think it's important to say then as well how uncertainty impacts coercion and abuse in this debate. Because if it is the case that you don't fully understand that text, but you are still compelled and like feel fundamentally that you may go to hell, we think it's likely that you increase the extreme and fundamentalist practices that you engage in. That was to say that you overcorrected for perceived lacks of understanding in that text. Note the fact that the language being particularly visceral, particularly violent, was likely to engender those responses. I think that meant that when you take into consideration the counterfactual, that is, this happens in families, you're likely to get a worse point. That's directly responsive to the claim that this was symmetric with regards to family abuse. It's not symmetric. When you internalize that uncertainty, but you still believe you could go to hell, you're worse. But secondly, as we tell you at Rose, you obviously have a greater degree of investment in whether or not your child goes to heaven comparative to the priest. The extent to which they were likely to lay on that coercion to you was greater under their side. And I just want to note the empirical context of all of the illustrious cases of like abuse that they want to talk about that were currently in the news. Things like the Duggar family, things like Bill Lockhart were literal families. There were instances where religiosity was able to manifest toxically within those insular communities without the outsized impact from other people. And note the fact that the existence of religious institutions was an exclusive and crucial benefit because those were the only people you listened to challenge your bad religious beliefs and the legitimacy of those. That was the exclusive benefit upon which we won that point. Next, on spiritual experience, experience and who actually gets benefits for people on that point. They tell you that now people get more choice because they get a greater degree to which they can like interpret this with their own discretion. A couple of responses here. Firstly, note the fact that under their side of the house, there are likely to exist dominant and hegemonic conceptions of religion that are not as spectral and varying as we see under our side of the house. That was the fact that now we had liberalizing churches, progressive churches that catered for things like LGBTQ people. We think that doesn't exist under their side of the house because the dominant perception of that religion is that it is hegemonically like parochial or anti-gay. You never actually get a smaller church coming out and say, actually, this is a manner in which you can interpret that text because they have an incentive to do so. At the point at which that other option wasn't made available to you through a religious institution, you never actually realized that there was that varying degree of interpretation. You just see it as something that was utterly inaccessible to you. The impact of that is obviously that we get to co-opt the point about marginalized people and tell you why they have a greater degree of access because these individual churches facilitate that. It's secondly the fact that it just mitigates their response if you don't have any choices. I think the second thing to say in response to greater degree of interpretive discretion is obviously that's not the case that people do this in a way that is good. I think if you value people being able to meaningfully actualize their religion, it probably matters whether or not they know what's actually in the text. And so far as we prove to you that on net, the educative capacity of these churches means they're likely to know more, likely to disseminate that information in a way that is clearer, means people probably get a greater degree of religious access. The third thing here, and this is really important, is I think it just really needs to be challenged, the mutual exclusivity of the benefit the government team brings out in this debate. You can still meditate under our side of the house. You can still have songs. You can still interpret things how you want to. The attenuating force of religious institutions was a benefit. I'll take a POI from closing.
From 0 AD to 1960, the official stance of the Catholic Church that Jews were personally responsible for Jesus. Is this the type of moderating critique you defend on your side?
Yeah, but there were also obviously other points in histories in which the like secular political like persecution of Jews existed. I don't think that was like singular to churches. Even if it was the case, like religious institutions sometimes facilitated that. Note the current trajectory which we are on, which is towards the liberalization. We think that is the natural evolution of churches and their incentives to proselytize. Okay, lastly on institutions and what were the unique benefit of them that we just think extended the margin for us in this debate. That was the fact that they delivered things like charity. Note that was independent to the current categorization of religious people currently being talked about in this debate. Those are people being fed. Those are people getting actual resources they need. Next, responding to like the claim that it is principally bad to have people like on a pedestal and have that power asymmetry. Note that was just a principled refutation to the very existence of religions. I don't see like why that differential exists, why you don't think it's bad for people to worship a god. But secondly, note the fact that we tell you that those things are specifically attenuated by the forces of having a lot of people in a church, a lot of people go into a church, and the number of people who likely just want to have a reasonable good time mitigates all of those harms of having extremely coercive institutions. We were the only side of the house to give you the unique benefit. We were the only side of the house to actually protect vulnerable individuals. So proud to oppose.
Great, member of government.
Fantastic. POIs in the chat. I'll take one around 5:30ish. If I don't take one at like 5:50, feel free to unmute and ask. Okay. The difference between Serbs and Croats is not linguistic. They speak the same language. The difference between Serbs and Croats is not ethnic. They are the same people. It is not historical. They have lived under the same kingdoms for generations. The difference is religious. Croats are Catholic, Serbs are Orthodox. And it is this religious boundary that is soaked in blood and is the side that opposition needs to defend. Institutional religion has been uniquely responsible for devastating violence throughout history, and we think that this is the largest and most important impact in the round. A couple of things in this speech. One, talking retroactively why institutional religion is comparatively and uniquely responsible for scales of violence which would not have occurred on the comparative. And then two, where we think textual absolutist religion is exclusive to institutional religion, while we're more likely to get pluralistic and dynamist religion on our side of the house. Firstly, on the comparative, I want to say that this is retrospective. It is a prefers a world motion, which is we don't need to just defend, as OO wants to defend, the liberalization of faiths in the last 40 years. We have to defend all of human history and the millennia where religions have defended doctrine of destruction and dominance over other faiths, and the millions that have died as a consequence. So their quip to my POI about liberalization in the last few years is not sufficient to weigh them over, and their very narrow scope of the debate. This is also the problem with OG in the debate. One, let's talk about why theocratic faiths institutional religion is unique for creating types of apolitical theocratic states, which are the prerequisite for creating certain types of violence. One, in order to accumulate the scale of wealth necessary to have a large centralized political organization, you need to be an institutional faith which can organize large political action. Sure, I think OO is correct in saying that potentially institutional religion still exists to some extent, but there is a difference when you rely on that religious institution to have a connection through God, when giving money is the avenue by which you enter heaven, and the only people who are capable of interpreting text for you are the religious authorities. Note, people were not literate for most of history, which means that you are highly dependent on those people, and they are capable of accumulating a greater degree of power and wealth on the comparative. Two, that they are capable of dictating a unified doctrine. The fact that you are dependent on them for the exact interpretation of the Bible or the Quran or like the Vedas means that they are the ones who are telling you what you should take from that. There is an inability on our side of the house for them to dictate doctrine. If they tell you that the Bible is justified for holy war, you cannot do that if you don't rely on other people, a centralized organization, to do that. Thirdly, they even if they are not a political organization in themselves, they don't have the capacity to they have the capacity to mobilize individual membership to a particular agenda. That is, even if the Catholic Church isn't a state in and of itself, it is able to mobilize particular voters in Latin America or Europe in order to believe a particular doctrine, because the membership is dependent and listens to them for their every word, because they are the direct word of God, which means that even if they aren't states in and of themselves, they are capable of dictating people into mass mobilized action, whether this be political or whether this be sort of like exogenous warfare, etc. So we think that there's likely a capacity for mobilization, even if they aren't in and of themselves political institutions. Why then do organized religions have a series of harmful incentives that are unique? One, they want to maintain memberships. They want to make it difficult for members to leave. This is things like you're going to dramatically punish apostasy. Two, they want to maintain legitimacy. And note, this is missing from OG. That is, they want to portray themselves as the only correct interpretation of a faith, and that all other surrounding faiths, especially in geographic proximity, because those are the groups that you're most likely to lose membership from, are either entirely wrong or evil or antithetical to the word of God. So it's not just enough to say that Orthodox in the Balkans are wrong or that they're different, but that we are the only correct ones, and their belief is inherently heretical, evil, and wrong. That the people who believe these are incorrect and we need to get rid of them because their interpretation is taking away membership and challenging beliefs in that. And we think this happens also from the family unit, right? At the point at which people have individual interpretations, they don't care if my children leave my faith. But to the point at which institutional religions have inbred for generations that we are the only correct belief, I am, as a family member, also going to buy into this narrative and believe that if my child converts to Orthodoxy or converts to Islam in India, that this is an affront to me and a violence against my child, which means I am more likely to inflict the type of abusive violence that OO is talking about in this debate. Why then is this likely to lead? Finally, they're often also likely to monopolize certain ethnic groups or make religion inherently identitarian. That is, forming ethnic groups around religious identity, the difference between Croats and Serbs, the difference between Urdu speakers and Hindi speakers, right? The note is that your capacity for identity formation is also comparative in this debate. OO concedes this when they say that religion is important for community formation. These types of religious communities, often across time and across periods, form ethnic boundaries by which people insularly identify. What does this lead to? A, that in order to assert dominance or to maintain dominance of your faith, you need to eliminate or exterminate other groups, or at the very least forcibly convert them into your faith. This looks like things by residential schools, ethnic movement, ethnic cleansing of particular groups, or forcible migration as you organize a political, unitary group. And this is justified under the pretense of the belief that these groups are fundamentally evil. We think that this is humongous. Second, the ability to motivate people to even participate in holy wars in the first place is also comparative in this debate, right? At the point at which I'm sending someone else to die, to kill another people, it is very hard to justify that. And the boundary to barrier to justify that is much easier when I have generations of religious justification to do so. So the political anti-Semitism is rooted in the institutional beliefs of the Catholic Church that Jews are evil and Jews killed Jesus. That is where the anti-Semitism stemmed. It didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of a religious institutional belief. That is the problem in this debate. Okay, secondly then, why do we think that this motion implies you're more likely to have pluralistic text, again responding to OO in this debate? We think at the point at which most people weren't literate throughout history, we think that religion's texts are less likely to be the basis by which religions are based, right? Because people weren't literate, right? States didn't have the resources in order to educate most people to be literate, and the institutions which are capable of leveraging funds to teach people how to read were religious institutions which don't exist to the same capacity in our side of the house, which means stories and religious beliefs are more likely to be things like oral traditions or stories that are passed down from generation to generation. This is obviously comparatively good for 3 levels. 1, it means that the people who are interpreting the text for you aren't the 1% of the literate elite in medieval Europe who are the only people who can speak Latin or Sanskrit or Quranic Arabic, etc., which means now you have the better ability to interpret the stories in and of it yourself for most of history, right? Most people weren't literate until the 19th century when secular public schools became immensely popular. But 2, it also means that there is a capacity for the religious doctrine to change across time. Stories from generation to generation are a lot easier to change than explicit texts like the Bible, which says homophobic shit in it explicitly, which means the boundary for reform is also greater on our side of the house when you're not highly dependent on texts which are distributed and entrenched by religious institutions. On our side, we say religions are responsible for immense bloodshed, damage, which is comparative we are so proud to propose.
Great. Member of opposition.
Hello, am I clearly visible and audible?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, Abhishek, can you hand me my phone? Just with hand. Thanks. Okay, I'll take at least 1 point from opening government. Sorry for not offering by PM. We were having issues with our tech as we had the whole day actually. Okay, I'll take 2 if I can to make up for that. Oh, there's another page. Here. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think first let's address what opening government says and explain why extension will be top half. The thing is that OG's claim is that minorities are going to feel like they don't belong. Specifically, gay people are going to be told that they don't belong. Our claim is a bit more large in terms of its scope, but it's a lot more likely than CG's claim of war. What is our claim? Which is that gay people are minorities who are discriminated because of the way that they behave. But you know what another thing is that makes you very vulnerable and makes your life really shit? Being poor, and there's a lot more poor people than there are gay people. And I think that by itself should tell you why CO's extension is just bigger than opening governments. You can't really tell me that a gay person's life not being accepted by the people around them, maybe while having food and support from the church, is worse than a poor person's life when they literally can't feed themselves, are sick all the time. And guess what? All the harms from OG occur to them as well. Specifically, discrimination is easier when you don't have ways to protect yourself. Sexual abuse, much easier if you don't have money and are desperately working for an employer that you depend on. And every other possible harm they talk about in terms of violence, in terms of feeling like you're not valuable in your identity to God, all also become pretty fucking large when you don't have the money to support yourself. So just on scale, we have more people. If you don't believe that they're more intense, it's irrelevant because there's just so many more of them. So our claim is just why these poor people get jack shit on-site government. The first thing I'm going to do is explain to you why donations go away on-site government. First of all, note that you need a trust or a set of belief systems that really care about churches and priests and institutions in order to donate money when they ask for volunteers for a program or money that they need to use for projects that they push for in the first place. The reason this won't happen if you have a personal belief in God is because you have less of a relationship to these priests in the first place. You often don't know what they're doing. You barely care about the church at all. You don't go to it regularly because it's not a big part of your life. If GovWhip comes up and tries to avoid having to tape the motion by saying, no, you do go to the church, you do talk to these priests, you still donate, then they lose a lot of their benefits because then the institution is sort of the core of your religious beliefs. Presumably, you just don't go to church every Sunday. You go to church like maybe once every few months, like most people nowadays do, who don't care that much about religion. Which means you don't know about the donations, you don't care enough, you're not told regularly. Second of all, you just have other priorities that take precedent because you don't believe your religious legitimacy is affected at all by whether or not you help the institution. It's affected by your own personal interpretation of God. So if you don't believe that donations are crucial, which you probably won't, because you will probably prioritize your family, your own happiness, your values, your ethical structures opening government talks about, because that needs to a lot less for you to give up. It makes it easier for you to live your life as someone who's a bit more selfish. It means that you think, actually, God doesn't really need me to throw all this money. He's happy with me as long as I don't know, talk to my mom every Friday. It's just a less less like taxing way to believe that you're a good person. The second thing is not only do you not know about this or care about this, institutions just don't hold as much respect in general. So it's not just average people, it's also rich people, especially upper middle class people who often donate to these places to seem good in their community, which looks like rich people showing that they are supporting the Muslim community and brotherhood by showing a bunch of money, showering a bunch of money onto mosques, which they can use for all their programs. The reason for this being comparative is because if you have personal beliefs in God, the institution itself has less relevance in the society, right? Like less people care that much about what the mosque says or what the local Maulana says or what the local, like, Hindu Pandit says. So it just doesn't matter if you donate money to them, it doesn't give you much value. Now, obviously, Gov might say, no, you donate money to charity. But obviously, this is also not the case because charity, NGOs, and sort of other organizations that help people don't give you the type of moral value that religions do because it's not as consistently relevant in people's lives. So you think about the Red Cross once when you read an article, but when someone donates to your mosque, every time you go to the mosque, you get that legitimacy. So the incentive to donate for rich people is very high for religion. For charities, is quite low because it's not as consistent in people's lives and is not seen as something as important. But also, the rich people might also just believe that they're a good person for donating, but they don't. So the first mechanism also applies to the second one and strengthens its power. The third reason donations get reduced is just you just don't care enough to be a priest who even asks for donations or starts a soup kitchen or starts langar in a Sikh temple or a gurdwara where you can actually give them food. Because note right now, one of the main reasons to be a priest is, you're closer to God, you're part of like the holy church, you're someone who is better as a human being as a result of this. But if it's a personal relationship and there's no value in it, then like literally there's just no value in being a priest in the first place. In which case, first of all, this makes a lot of Gov's claims a bit weird, which is like in their side, when the priests are no longer there, people will have like good beliefs because now if there's no priests, you know what? Fuck that. That implication Abhishek will do in rebuttal, but the gist of it is like people still have societal beliefs. The priests don't have any impact on it. We agree with that. But anyway, the point is there's less priests. There's no real benefit at all you get from being part of the church. But from our side, there's more people working in the church and hence they do more donations. The second burden to prove our extension is why there's immensely good ways in which this money is used. Why is it put into charity? Why is it put into helping people and then weighing? Let me prove that, but before that, opening government.
Tax deductions and images of suffering are far more psychologically motivating to donate for humans who still possess ethical and altruistic values on either side of the house. On the comparative, the violence acted against queer people, women, and children is uniquely empowered by institutional authorities.
Okay, do you want to ask a second POI? Because I didn't ask your PM. Okay, no, fine. So the first response to this is you get desensitized to images. This is empirically true. We know this in reality. The second response to the gay people and women are discriminated thing is something Abhishek will expand on. How does OG solve the problem? Because their logic is you now think God loves you, but that doesn't solve everyone else telling you that you're a piece of shit, because presumably your family also doesn't treat you as well if they were willing to give you up, because maybe the priest isn't telling them that you're evil, but then even if they have a personal relationship with God, if gay people are just hurt in society in general, then they still believe that you're a bad person and then leave you. So all the harms occur anyway. But second, like, I don't understand why they solve it on their side if the personal belief doesn't have any incentive to change, which is also OO's response. But fuck it, that's Abhishek's job. Why will you do good types of donations? First of all, we know empirically that people mostly donate. But second of all, scriptures need to be moral. I know CG has a response to this, right? Like, it's like people can't read. The thing is, it's irrelevant, right? Like, the consistent belief of your religion is still very clear to people. Because even if people are saying it, they need to agree with the other priests. So if 5 people tell you different things, it's difficult to get legitimacy for Christianity. So on our side, when institutions are strong, scriptures tend to be good. Why? Because of proselytization. 3 reasons proselytization is crucial, something OO doesn't explain to you, and why it will make you do good things. First, note that it's really morally good to accept more people from other religions. And hence, people who are poorer, who are the easiest to accept by giving them things like charity and support, are the most best way for you to become a good person in the eyes of God. Hence, you want to give charity. Second of all, followers give you more influence, and that just means that you want more power as a religion. OG's logic is you want population growth, which is very speculative. You don't know how much these heterosexual couples will fuck, but the more important claim is that followers are a certain benefit that come from other religions that you believe are actually spreading sinful beliefs in the first place. So you do things like donations. And like I told you multiple times, there's no alternative because governments don't care that much about poor people because they don't flip between parties. They often only have one choice. So they're not an important swing voter block. But either way, if that is responded, again, Abhishek will repeat it. Okay, hopefully after weighing, CO goes through this round.
Alrighty, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Fantastic. I'm going to call for a POI roughly halfway through from back half. Oh, sorry. Three, two, one. Let's go team by team, starting with OG. First, let's talk about their framing. They say that you just simply aren't going to talk about religion with your community. But obviously, this is uncharitable. In Gov's world, you're still obviously going to learn your religion from your community. No one invents their religion on their own. And so this is why there's an unclear delta with respect to all of their stuff on epistemic coercion, because it's still going to be your community telling you what to think. Yes, you'll get a little bit more customization out of it, but it's just a different form of epistemic coercion. So don't let them win on that. Next, they say it's still under framing that you're going to read the scripture on your own. But as we've explained, this applies in a minority of cases. Most people throughout history can't read, so they can't do this. So it's far more likely that non-institutional religions are going to take the form of oral religions, and we uniquely show why these are better for achieving all the benefits that OG wants to get at. Next, on marginalization, they say that institutions want followers, and so they do bad things like indoctrinating you, social pressure, coercion, shutting down criticism, etc. This is all good. Our stuff's better. Why? Quite simply, our impacts are way bigger. War and conflict matter much more than whether or not you get coerced. It is better to be coerced and alive than to be not coerced and dead, for obvious reasons. Okay, let's talk then about two more things from OG. First, on minorities, specifically focusing on gay people. For gay people, as other teams have pointed out, there's honestly an unclear delta here. Like, communities are also going to want procreation. So communities are also going to have incentives to create homophobic religions that they then pass on to the children. Yes, the children can customize it a little bit, but yeah, maybe gay people will customize it a little bit when they grow up. But if the community at large still holds homophobic beliefs as a result of this more personalized, more communitarian religion, I don't know what the delta is. Next, we prove religions progress way faster on our side over the centuries, and when they're more orally based, and so we get the benefits of social progress of helping fight homophobia. Lastly, on customization, as other teams have already pointed out, it's really unclear how much of this is unique to Gov's world. Like, you can also customize by journaling, by meditating on ops side. I really don't know why any of this is asymmetric. They say you can interpret it in your own way, but they never actually explain why you're going to do this well, especially given how little information you have and how little help you're going to have. So that's OG dealt with. Okay, let's talk OO. I have a lot to say here. First, they say that your family is going to be a worse actor to be teaching you religion because you're dependent on them and because you love them. I want to flag first that on both sides, your family is going to be imposing religion on you. They're going to play a central role in teaching you religion. Why? Because in the status quo, look around, gut check, most religious institutions legitimize the authority of the father and say that they have the authority to teach religion to their children in combination with what the priest does. Note that religious indoctrination doesn't just happen in the church. It happens inside and outside the church. And so, but even if there's a trade-off, I think this is good because families obviously are more likely to have your best interests in mind. This is for evolutionary reasons. We've evolved to care about our children, and also just for emotional reasons. You love them. This impersonal priest who might be corrupt, who might be awful, probably doesn't have these kinds of similar incentives. Okay, great. Let's talk a little bit about their stuff on standardized practices. First, they say that religions have scholars, and this is really good for getting you like epistemic certainty. Gut check this. Indigenous religions throughout history have lacked like institutional scholars, but they've still had extraordinarily deep faiths. It's clearly not a prerequisite to have deep faith to have institutional scholars. Next, they say religious institutions help provide charity. I'm going to respond to this a lot more when I talk about CO, but we can easily outweigh this just by the worst things that religions do, like crusades. Obviously, a crusade has more impacts than providing a little bit of charity, but I'm going to mitigate it heavily later. Next, they say that religious institutions provide opportunities like group prayer. I don't think this is symmetric. I don't think this is asymmetric. Like, people who want to do this on our side can still do it. You can get together with some of your friends, even if you think that the locus of your connection with God is on a personal level. Presumably, if you're going to get some satisfaction out of doing it as a community, you can still do it. I don't know the asymmetry. Lastly, they say that, they say next you can more easily critique institutions than you can individuals. Sure, maybe you can more easily critique them, but institutions can also more easily shut you up. They have the capacity to do it and they have the incentive to do it, as Reese explained to you. Okay, 2 more points from OO. Next, they say that institutions want to look like good moral actors, and so they're going to be good people or good institutions. I'm going to flip this right here. Why? Because to get followers, it is far easier to demonize other institutions than to make your own institution look good and to do good things. The obvious gut check for this is that negative ads in politics are way more effective than positive ads. The gut check for why this is true is turn on the TV, all you see are negative ads. And so, as Reese explained to you, you're going to have far more hatred between religions when they try to gain followers, not by being good themselves, but instead by making the others seem awful, by demonizing them, by saying that they're sinners, by saying that they're ontologically evil, etc. So you get all the more conflict and violence they will lie to you. Last point from O is that people can't interpret texts alone, and so they struggle. We explained, yes, this is true. This is precisely why religions are probably going to be more oral on our side, which has all the benefits of it's intergenerational flexibility that actually leads to social progress and actually leads to gay people getting rights. Okay, I'll take the POI from top half before going to CO.
Religious beliefs that are incredibly politically mobilizing still exist under your side of the house. Why don't states have a symmetric incentive to leverage those things? The only difference being that accuracy does not exist facilitated by those religious institutions.
So sure, states are going to have other incentive to do wars. Yes, there's probably still going to be wars on the basis of like colonialism and whatnot. But we're saying that we remove a reason for wars, which is religions and theocratic states operating in a sort of synthesis that gives rise to irrational, awful wars justified only by the doctrine that is found in scripture. I think that is pretty clear. Okay, let's talk CO, their stuff on poverty. First, all their stuff on money being used well is all derivative from OO, and I've already responded to it. So I'm just going to engage with poverty directly. First, communities can form secular mutual aid organizations on our side, and they're likely to do so. Why? Well, there's just basically a revealed preference for communities setting up systems to help themselves. If they do it on our side, they're probably going to do it on our side. But more specifically, most of these personal religions, which ultimately come from the community, because again, no one creates a religion ex nihilo, these personal religions are probably still going to tell you to do some amount of charity. The community is going to set them up thusly because obviously the community wants everyone in the community to be helping, to be doing charity. So your personal religion is probably still going to motivate you to a significant extent to do charity, and probably institutions will be set up to facilitate this. Also, more donations, which they outline, is entirely contingent on conversions, which has all of the harms that we outlined to you: forcible conversions, expansionary policy, etc. Two more points. One is obviously just outweighed by the violence. It's better to be alive and poor than to be dead. And lastly, lots of the donations are wasted on fancy buildings and other nonsense and perks for priests, because there's tons of corruption in religious institutions, mainly because there's little to no accountability. Even if these people like believe that they are God's chosen soldier, still oftentimes they will just succumb to selfishness because it is easier. And you can believe that you're building this awesome building as a monument to God rather than just as a cool place to chill with your homies. Okay, that brings us nicely to our case. We explain to you crucially why it is that powerful institutions, because yes, maybe there are institutions on outside too, but super powerful institutions are the tipping point for getting massive amounts of violence, both between states, from state to non-state actors, and from non-state actors to non-state actors. How religion's uniquely way better than our top half. We explain why they can mobilize people, why they have the capacity, why they have the incentive to expand, to conquer, to delegitimize, to demonize, etc., to kill, to forcibly converse, etc., and why they are going to send others to die, why religious leaders are going to send others to die in their wars. But if I'm a personal person with a personal religion, or even in a community, I'm not going to have the incentive to like fly halfway around the world to go die. And so lastly, we explain also why we get more pluralism on our side when religions are far less text-based and far more oral. And this means that communities at large can shape their religions more in line with their preference and incentives over time. And then the arc of history can bend more towards progress, as Barack once said. At the end of the day, the reason for the CG win are clear. We have by far the biggest impacts, massive amounts of death, massive amounts of violence, massive amounts of suffering. And we show crucially unlocking why it is that, given that these religions are going to be meaningfully influenced by a community, they will actually get better over time. So we do protect the most vulnerable minorities, and we allow religions to ensure that people are the maximally fulfilled. For all those reasons, so proud to propose. Thank you very much.
Great. And to conclude the debate, opposition whip.
Yeah. Can I check if I'm clearly audible?
You are.
Yeah, just give me around 10 seconds. Cool. Yeah, I'll probably take a POI on the 5th minute, preferably from opening. Do keep a POI ready. POIs preferably via chat. Once as my clock happened. Okay. Starting my speech then in 3, 2, 1, go. First, a note on rebuilding. We are clearly not derivative. One, Shaurya clearly explains to you a proselytization very crucial religions, right? Which then means that you really want to show why donation money happens. Or tells you that, religions get more progressive. There are different mechanisms. But two, note, even if O proves that, donations are good, we clearly showed you in a comparative why donations stop on their side, which then much more clearly shows the extent of the impact on our side of the house. Now let's move on to opening government. Government has three broad claims. Firstly, in terms of marginalized communities and minorities. Secondly, in terms of abusive power structures. Thirdly, in terms of just gaining some sense of word, or let's say acquire some epistemic access to religion. Marginalized communities, right? One broad claim over here. There are other narratives in terms of why these people are otherized and discriminated against, in terms of racism, in terms of them being different from heteronormative norms, which then means they probably still feel otherized on their side of the house. But note that mechanism to prove why people feel good and accepted is that, you can come up with your own interpretation. Concede in Shaurya's pure attempt that in many instances it is ingrained among the parents or the community that there exist beliefs that say that you potentially think of these people as others. Why is this so, and why is this probably true on their side as well? Because probably many scriptures explicitly state or exclude these groups. This is why the structural beliefs were formed, which then means even the majority on their side, who are probably not gay or not cured, probably do not necessarily consider them accepted by God or loved by God until there exists sufficient force and convert them. I don't think that necessarily happens on their side. So I'm not very sure the marginalized on their side. But secondly, in terms of just structures of abuse, right? The problem over here is that you need to spend time in different communities, right? If you're not opting into religion, which I do agree, maybe coerced in some instances, you're probably spending time in other asymmetric power structures, such as work or your family. Just a simple intuition pump over here. Your priest may help you combat other structural abuses. For example, if family is abusing you, your family may help you if the priest is abusing you. But weighing on OG, I'm not sure if the church, let's say, helps you combat more abuse or creates more abuse in of itself. But even it doesn't matter to all of you. One very simple thing: you're the most vulnerable when you're poor. It's very, very simple, right? When you're poor, you're just easier to abuse. You can be forced into sexual abuse because you want to create some amount of money. You may be forced in terms of coercive workplace structures and very poor work conditions because you want to have food on your table. At that point of time, you probably broadly impact many more people via our structures of abuse than OG is able to access. But finally, in terms of their ability to get better self-actualization or just better connection to religion, right? It's a very highly speculative impact because I'm not sure if they get that impact. What do they do with it? I'll also bring in OO over here because the contestation on top of is broadly that, you have better connection to religion. This religion could be meaningful. This religion is more accepting. Let's weigh all of that in comparison with the closing off case. Firstly, is in terms of uniqueness. Note, no other factor makes you feel that you are, let's say, necessarily a good person. The first thing then is to just point out that I'm not very sure how it necessarily affects your life in the first place, right? For example, sure, you may feel good because of your connection to religion, but you know what? If you're probably poor and you are not able to feed yourself, or you have a very bad job and you're very stressed out of it, those things probably affect you much more tangibly than, let's say, this religious connection can do to you. These have many more visceral and tangible impacts for people. But secondarily, I'm not very sure, especially when there are existential conditions that really make you feel shit. For example, not being able to actually have choices or lots of agency because you simply don't have the money to exercise that agency. Or for example, that, in many instances, you're forced into suffering because of choices you need to make to feed yourself. I'm not sure how religion helps you in those circumstances. I think then, why simply on universality, we have a much larger scope of impact. Your sexuality can be important to you in romantic relationships. Being a woman may lead to some priests discriminating against you and telling you to be a housewife, etc. But note, in every single instance, money is a singularly most important part of your life. If you don't have money, you simply feel bad in most instances. But furthermore, minorities just simply need more money than other people. It may it be gay people, may it be, let's say, religious, or let's say, may it be racial minorities, right? Because you know what? They need to pay their rent. They need to have food. This makes them much more vulnerable to abuse at the point of time they aren't able to get access to this money. But finally, note intensity of being poor in the first place, right? Note, this is literally about life and death. It's not about being able to feed yourself. This is about which is much, much bigger of an impact than a God not loving you. But also understand, look, you can stop making God important in life because on our side, you can just have many other different sources of meaning. We're not sure whether a singular source of meaning from religion is that crucial or gives you much more happiness than other sources of meaning, right? But also note, who mitigates this by saying that there are other sects of religion? This doesn't beat OG. We clearly showed you this. We clearly showed you how money is a singularly issue this mitigation is enough to beat them because it means money is impossible to get from elsewhere. We weaponize O's mechanisms in vain. But note, if you don't have money, you're simply dead and you do not have agency. think then, what exactly does money lead to? And this is very crucial before I move on to closing government. Look, this probably means that you have soup kitchens wherein actively, and you just see this in your day-to-day communities, right? You have multiple stalls where poor are fed dinner and lunch, and they line up to get fed over there. This probably means you have free clinics, wherein churches and madrasas set up places where people can go and get treated at very low cost that they cannot access elsewhere. This probably means that you have religious schooling institutions. Yes, there may be criticisms of it, but you are at least giving access to people who cannot afford education elsewhere via this. PYOG.
You never proved that churches would use most donations on charity when there's incentive to use the money for recruitment. Even then, we told you that blackmail is not justified by the ends, given it erases agency and is uniquely
I get
coercive
that,
when
but here's the problem,
examination.
right? How did recruitment happen in the first place? In many instances, we're targeting poor, vulnerable people, saying you're going to feed you. In many instances, recruitment happens by offering people free treatment, by giving these people some piece of land that they can live on, giving free food and shelter, right? In many instances, giving vulnerable people pathway to live a dignified life. That is why they're being recruited in the first place. This maybe ties into our case in terms of how you're helping really vulnerable people. Finally, let's move on to closing government. I think there's a big problem with closing government. It's a problem of causality and correlation. Yes, religions may have been the reasons for war in certain instances. The problem is, in many instances, religions are used as justification as compared to being the root cause in the first place. The Crusades happened because, many Central European and Western European kingdoms were afraid of the Muslims and the Arabs moving into Central Europe. They had an existential threat, which is why this conflict occurred. Maybe in a world where religion was not so dominant, you would have just called it something else. It wouldn't be called the Crusades. It would have just been labeled something, maybe, I don't know, so Central European War or something else, because the threat would still exist. There are many reasons for why war can happen in terms of territorial conflicts over different ethnicities, races, different identities. Religion is this region of the reason of religion is removed. I'm not sure why the other reasons would not become more prevalent, or they would probably not come to the forefront, right? The idea here being, no, religion can lead to war. I'm not sure if war inherently reduces the number at the point when religion doesn't exist, because of multiple other factors to war, because war is very convoluted, right? You need a lot of incentive to go to war in the first place because of how bad it is, which then means just taking away religion probably doesn't change that. Hence, very, very proud to oppose.
Great. Thanks everyone for the excellent round. We will presumably announce the results in Zoom or Discord. Good luck.
Thank you.